Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. Today we are going to be discussing, does God prefer a monarchy? So yes, we are now crossing over into politics officially. So it is ironic that the political system with the longest standing in human history and with a proven pedigree for stability and national identity is usually scoffed at by most Americans and Westerners. Monarchy is diametrically opposed to democracy and is seemingly incompatible with the rugged individualism and self-autonomy that most Americans crave, or subconsciously accept as the norm. Despite a general pessimism towards politics and politicians, pragmatism keeps the marriage between the two-party system and the American public afloat. This reality can provoke a few questions. Which political system is the best for the common good? And which best reflects divine and natural law? So I will suggest that monarchy answers these questions better than any other alternative, politically speaking. So first we'll begin with the biblical view. According to Pew Research, somewhere between 65 to 70% of Americans self-identify as Christian, which indicates that the Bible has or should have at least some authority in the lives of 2/3 of Americans. Although it is debatable, I propose that the Bible promotes monarchy as the prototypical, natural, and ideal form of government. I will cover a few generalities and then a few biblical passages to support my position. The general principle of authority coming from on high, from God, and not from below, should automatically render democracy as antithetical to Christianity, right? So, God is the source of authority, and he institutes it from above, whereas democracy, the authority comes from the people, the will of the people. So the will of God or the will of the people. So democracy seems to come from the will of the people, which people have a fallen, sinful default nature, would be antithetical from any authority above them. And as Americans, we typically don't like any authority above us. We have a natural rebellious tendency, which actually comes from our first parents, Adam and Eve, in the fall, right? So God, being the creator of everything, has authority over all creation. All people descend from one man, Adam. In fact, original sin is a type of democracy. In his sovereignty, God granted Adam and Eve a great deal of freedom and gave them only one commandment: do not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. When one reads wisdom literature of the Bible, it can easily be seen that wisdom, knowledge, and discerning between good and the bad are virtues. So why would God prohibit the first couple from pursuing those virtues? The reason is that God wanted Adam to learn from him in a divine way, and not in a way independent from God. But the serpent tempted the egos of the first couple to become gods and know good and evil for themselves. Thus, original sin had the democratic value of self-determination based on self-interest and self-autonomy, and even a secular one without God. Even after original sin and the fall, human authority came forth from a patriarch of the family, as the genealogies of Genesis chapter 5 demonstrate. A single patriarch was listed among several children. Later, Abraham would exemplify the leadership of the patriarch, making the executive decisions, employing servants, etc. Abraham also encountered other heads of state in his journeys, all of whom were kings, including the Pharaoh. What this illustrates is that in early societies, a single capable leader would emerge as the man whom the authority of final decisions would rest upon. This reflects the natural law very well, and this is also the reason why sheer logic leads to monotheism rather than polytheism. Later in Abraham's journey, and as a part of the covenant between the Lord and Abraham, God promotes that kings would be a part of Abraham's progeny. And really, contrary to that, democracy reflects paganism, vis-a-vis monarchy, which promotes Christianity. So let me quote from Genesis chapter 7, verses 4 through 6. This is a prophecy about kings that would come forth from Abraham. Quote, "And God said to him, I am, and my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name be called any more Abram, but thou shalt be called Abraham, because I have made thee a father of many nations, and I will make thee increase exceedingly, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee." Close quote. The fact that kings would come forth from Abraham's loins could indicate God's approval for monarchy, as the context is that of a blessing and not a general prophecy of historical accident. At the end of the life of Moses, the greatest prophet of Israel's history, God also prophesies of future kings. This is now from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 and 15. Quote, "When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God will give thee, and possess it, and shalt say, I will set a king over me, as all nations have that are round about. Thou shalt set him whom the Lord thy God shall choose out of the number of thy brethren. Thou mayest not make a man of another nation king, that is not thy brother." Close quote. Here, the Lord gives specific instructions that Israel shall only appoint a king whom he chooses, and it cannot be a man who is a foreigner, since God cannot command anything which is immoral or contrary to his character, and God is foreseeing and giving positive instructions of selecting a king. We can conclude that monarchy is compatible with the rule of the Lord, who himself is a king, just as Jesus Christ is the King of kings and Lord of lords. That which is in heaven is to be reflected on the earth. The fact that God prescribed that ordained elders and priests would rule over Israel in the Torah, and then later on kings, also reflects this idea, just as Peter and the apostles would be the foundation of the church in the New Testament. After the time of Moses, there would usually be an individual with exceptional leadership skills who would lead Israel. Moses' successor, Joshua, led the military campaigns which enabled them to possess the Promised Land. The land was divided up into 12 tribes named after the patriarchs, and the first type of government in early Israel was that of a tribal confederacy. This was short-lived, however, as the Israelites would sin by assimilating into the surrounding pagan culture, and then God would deliver them up to their enemies. The pressure to compromise into the culture and the collective will of their neighbors was often too much to resist for the Israelites. When they got into too much trouble and apostasy, they would call unto the Lord, and God would send them a military deliverer called a judge, whose leadership the Israelites would be saved from their enemies until their next relapse. This was the recurring cycle of events until a priest judge named Samuel came onto the scene. Samuel was among the best of their judges in history, but Samuel's sons were corrupt. The people saw the corruption of Samuel's sons, and they demanded that Samuel anoint them a king so that they could be like the other nations. God saw this as a rejection of God's divine kingship, but nevertheless he told Samuel to give the people what they wanted. And you can find this in the book of 1 Samuel and or 1 Kingdoms, chapter 8, verses 5 through 7. Those who reject monarchy today, that it is the biblical ideal, usually cite this as their primary evidence. They would say, see, God saw the people's demand for a king as something as sinful and rejecting him as their king. So therefore, they say that the Bible does not promote monarchy as the ideal political system. But I would say not so fast. It wasn't so much as monarchy that was sinful in this occasion here in 1 Samuel or 1 Kingdoms chapter 8. It was the motive of the Israelites that was wrong, namely that they wanted to be like the other nations, when God actually called them out of the nations to be set apart and holy. See, the Israelites, they demanded a king so that they could be like the other nations. And they rejected God's kingship and the prophet, priest of Samuel and his sons. You know, his sons would eventually replace Samuel. They didn't want Samuel's sons to take Samuel's place. So they wanted to become like other nations. And that was the reason why God said, they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me. It wasn't the fact that they wanted a king, because We already saw in the prophecies given to Abraham and to Moses that kings would be an eventuality as a natural development of the Israelite nation. In fact, this event actually demonstrates the opposite, the fallacy of democracy, because it was the will of the people that demanded a king, and their will was misguided and ill-informed. Even when Samuel, via God's instruction, told them that this king that they wanted would actually enslave them and demand things, high taxes and lands, their will was set. We want a king to be like the other nations. So it was actually Samuel's submitting to the will of the people, which is really democracy. That was the fall of this, the fall into sin and apostasy of these Israelites. So the first monarch of Israel, King Saul, reflected this error of the Israelites. He was outwardly fit to be a king. He was a head taller than everybody else. He was strong, he was handsome, and he was a very good warrior. But inwardly his heart was far from God, as he failed to be obedient to the instructions of the Lord, as he compromised for self-gain. Eventually King Saul would have the Spirit of God removed from him, and it was replaced by an evil spirit. King Saul would eventually seek out a witch to tell his future, because God's Spirit had gone from him, and he would be killed in battle the next day once he sought out divination and the occult for knowledge. Saul's true successor would not be his son, but as the Lord himself selected the next true and prototypical king, whom was David. So now this is truly the Lord's choice, as the scripture says in 1 Samuel or 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 1. And the Lord said to Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, whom I have rejected from reigning over Israel? Fill thy horn with oil, and come, that I may send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king from among his sons. Close quote. So God himself would choose a king. So God is not going to choose a king for himself to be anointed if he rejects monarchy. So this would be a king after God's own choosing. It is here where God provides the king he chooses to rule over his people. David becomes Israel's ideal king, though he was not without making many mistakes and sins. And Jesus Christ himself is called the Son of David. So, if Jesus is called the Son of David, and Jesus himself is a king, how can God not approve of monarchy? When David is older, the Lord promises to establish his dynasty forever through his heir, Solomon. This the Lord says in 1 Chronicles 22, verse 10, quote, He shall build a house to my name, and he shall be a son to me, and I will be a father to him, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. Close quote. Of course, we know that David's dynasty through Solomon did not politically endure forever, despite Solomon's great political accomplishments, since the Israelites and most of their kings would later go apostate. The eternal kingship of David is realized through Jesus Christ, but the concept of monarchy is still upheld. But even when the Israelites were conquered and exiled, it was by other kings, and the Lord himself is the one who establishes or removes kingdoms from the earth. And you could check Proverbs chapter 8, verses 15, Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verses 20, Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, and many other scriptural passages that promote this idea that God promotes and establishes kings. Therefore, if we observe the exhaustive biblical evidence for monarchy, the vast majority of the passages describe monarchy in a positive way, with the only negative annotations being the erroneous motives of the Israelites that we read about in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and the immoral nature of individual kings, which itself is not a critique of monarchy. So the biblical criteria, if you weigh the positive against the negative, it's by far, as far as the will of God is concerned, in the positive. The negative has to do with human failures, not God's will. Now, for the historical view of kings in the past. Historically, monarchies have proven to be the most successful, most efficient, and most stable form of government, right? You don't have this gridlock of Congress and the Senate that we have, and the legislative branch of government that we have in the United States today, and the judicial courts always, being a battle, 5 against 4, really based on political ideology. And then you have the president trying to get things done despite this, and he has to then go by executive order, which is really a type of being a monarch, right? So eventually, every decision comes down to one man. That's just the natural law. So only in the past couple of centuries have monarchies vanished. But why have they vanished? The usual argument against monarchy is that there is a lack of checks and balances, and allegedly the American Constitution has the perfect model of the balance of power, but it's clearly not the case. On the other hand, this model also produces political gridlock, inefficient governing, and too little gets accomplished other than talking and arguing. Additionally, the same problems of having a bad monarch can also occur if an entire political party or a political system becomes corrupt. This is why Aristotle in The Politics correctly observes that democracies will eventually become oligarchies because the people will vote themselves favors and put themselves in economic and political debt. The chances of there being a majority of voters who are competent and with excellent leadership qualities are lower than if a single skilled person emerges as the leader of a nation. In other words, 51% of the people are not competent enough to rule the other 49%, right? Historically, such leaders emerge, and they bring their nations and empires into greatness. The Republic of the Romans eventually became an empire with an emperor. Because of their pagan foundation, the emperors became hopelessly corrupt and wicked, even scapegoating and persecuting Christians. It wasn't until Constantine the Great became the sole emperor that the Edict of Tolerance in the year 313 AD was decreed, eliminating the persecution of Christians. Within a generation, the former pagan Roman Empire became a Christian empire, and not long after that, the Arian heresy spread to the northern barbarians, who eventually sacked Rome, and Arian kings ruled the Roman Empire for a time. It wasn't until King Clovis, who married a Catholic princess, converted from Arianism to Christianity, and led the campaign to oust the Arians from the Roman Empire. King Clovis and his successors, who were part of the Merovingian dynasty, transformed the empire into a Catholic continent for good, and Europe was Catholic for an entire millennium, 1,000 years. Aside from the constant threat of the Muslims, the Mohammedans, beginning in the 7th century, the first inward revolt of Catholic Europe began with the Protestant revolt of the year 1517. So from Gregory the Great until the Protestant revolt, that's almost 1,000 years, and with King Clovis, even more than that. The main issue was in 1517 was the authority of the Pope and the Church, as the papacy is a type of monarchy in the ecclesial form. And a significant part of the millennium of Christendom was held down with the king ruling secular matters and the Pope ruling ecclesial matters. So you had the two swords. The church and state were not separate. They had different functions, and they were parallel to each other. The Protestants and the wars that followed divided up Europe and the nations according to religious factions. And 2 centuries later, Freemasonry was founded in England with the goal to destroy the Catholic Church via secularization and setting up of a universal brotherhood of man, which is a type of humanism, secular humanism. The biggest attack on the Catholic Church and monarchy was the French Revolution of 1789. Their first goal was to destroy the Catholic influence in France, and their second goal was to destroy the monarchy, as the two swords of Christian authority go hand in hand. The events of 1789, which included mass beheadings of clergy and nuns and nobles, led to the dissolving of the monarchies in the West and the setting up of democratic governments based on the will of the people through the philosophy of the Enlightenment. This inverts the concept that authority that comes from above, i.e. from God. and thus every person determines for themselves what is good and what is evil, just like the original sin of the Garden of Eden. Most monarchies, which actually govern, excluding the United Kingdom, left in the world today are in Islamic countries and a few nations in Africa and Asia. These have little influence on the world at large, in contrast to Catholicism before 1789. What these countries do accomplish is this: they maintain a national and cultural identity. And identity is crucial to maintaining a stable society based on shared values and virtues. A nation, or even a globe, without an identity will self-destruct and implode until a monarch emerges onto the scene, for better or for worse. And contrary to popular opinion, a monarch is not a self-willed tyrant who does as he pleases. A good monarch wants what is best for his people and knows that if he acts like a tyrant, then his people will revolt. A good monarchy is subject to tradition and the rule of law, both the natural law and the divine law of Christ and the virtues thereof, and is always seeking to employ the common good in virtues. Therefore, a king who knows his place and submits to the true king, Jesus Christ, is the ideal leader of a nation and of a people, who will govern with humility and with dignity for his people. This is the solution for the problems of today, the return of Christendom. So, therefore, monarchy is not only biblical, it is proven historically to unite a nation, even a continent, under common values. So you can still have nations in a continent with their national identities being distinct and their cultures being distinct and highly valued, and still have kings of those nations ruling under a common idea of Christendom, Christianity, meaning that all the civil laws should be reflecting the law of Christ and not contradictory and not secularized and not with this separation of church and state. And perhaps later we'll do an episode on church and state. So please feel free to comment below. Please like, please subscribe, hit the bell so that you get notified when more videos of this channel come up. And God bless. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen.